The meeting room felt cold and empty, despite being filled with hundreds of beings from across the galaxy. Elena Martinez sat in her chair and looked around at the faces that had become too familiar over the past 3 years. The same angry expressions, the same tired arguments, the same hopeless feeling that nothing would ever change. 600 years of war had left its mark on everyone in the room. The Zelkari representatives sat on one side, their blue skin looking pale under the harsh lights. Their large eyes showed the same exhaustion that Elena had seen in her own mirror that morning. On the other side, the Thraxian delegates shifted, restlessly in their seats. Their reptilian features were harder to read, but Elena had learned to see the weariness there too. The war had started before any of their great-grandparents were born. Nobody alive today remembered what it was like to live in peace. Elena had studied the history files many times, trying to understand how it all began. A trade dispute over mining rights in the Vega system had somehow grown into the largest conflict the galaxy had ever seen. Now hundreds of worlds were involved, billions were dead, and still the fighting continued. Jake Sullivan stood near the window, watching the ships move past the space station. His uniform was crisp and clean, but his face showed the weight of command. As the human military representative, he had to report the latest numbers to the council every week. This week was no different from the last 50 weeks. More dead soldiers, more destroyed ships, more refugees fleeing their homes. The Zelkari admiral was speaking now, his voice filled with the same anger Elena had heard countless times before. He blamed the Thraxians for attacking supply convoys. He demanded justice for the colony that had been bombed last month. He promised revenge for every Zelkari life that had been lost. The Thraxian general stood up quickly, her scales changing color as her emotions rose. She accused the Zelkari of breaking the peace treaties. She listed the attacks on Thraxian outposts. She swore that her people would never surrender to what she called Zelkari aggression. Elena had heard these same arguments so many times that she could recite them from memory. Both sides were right, and both sides were wrong. Both had lost millions of their people. Both had committed terrible acts in the name of victory. Both were trapped in a cycle of violence that seemed to have no end. Lisa Parker sat at the human research table, typing notes on her computer. She was younger than Elena, but her studies of military history made her one of the most knowledgeable people in the room about warfare. Lisa had spent months analyzing battle reports, casualty figures, and strategic assessments. Her conclusion was always the same: this war could not be won by either side. The numbers were staggering. The Zelkari Empire controlled over 200 star systems and had a fleet of 50,000 warships. Their army numbered in the billions, and their weapons could destroy entire planets. The Thraxian Federation was equally powerful, with similar numbers of ships, soldiers, and devastating weapons. When two forces of such massive size fought each other, the result was not victory, but mutual destruction. Every major battle in the past century had followed the same pattern. One side would gain an advantage and push forward, capturing systems and destroying enemy forces. Then the other side would respond with an equally powerful counterattack, taking back what they had lost and inflicting similar damage. The front lines moved back and forth like waves on a beach, but the overall situation never changed. Ryan Adams received a message on his secure communicator. The captain had been waiting for this particular signal for weeks. He read the short text twice before deleting it from his device. After 600 years of conventional warfare, someone had finally decided to try something completely different. The message had come from Earth's high command, from offices so secret that most government officials didn't know they existed. It contained authorization for an operation that had been planned in the deepest levels of military intelligence. Operation Clean Sweep would either end the war or make it much worse. There was no middle ground. As the alien delegates continued their heated arguments, Ryan thought about the 12 people who were preparing for the most important mission in human history. They were not politicians or diplomats, they were soldiers, but unlike any soldiers the galaxy had ever seen. Their training was classified at levels that required special clearance just to know they existed. Their equipment was decades ahead of anything currently in use by any military force. The Zelkari admiral was now shouting at the Thraxian general. Other delegates were standing up, adding their voices to the chaos. Elena had seen this scene play out dozens of times before. Soon, someone would walk out in anger. The session would be suspended. Everyone would go back to their ships and their planets, and the war would continue. But this time would be different, though nobody in the room knew it yet. While the politicians argued about treaties and the generals planned their next battles, a small group of humans was preparing to do what 6 centuries of warfare had failed to accomplish. They would end the conflict not with massive fleets or planet-killing weapons, but with precision, speed, and the element of complete surprise. The meeting broke up in the usual chaos of angry voices and stormed exits. Elena gathered her papers and prepared to write another report about another failed peace conference. Lisa packed up her research data, knowing that next week she would have new casualty figures to analyze. Jake checked his communicator for updates from the front lines, expecting more bad news. None of them knew that in less than 24 hours, everything would change. The longest war in galactic history was about to end, not with a bang, but with a whisper. The briefing room was hidden deep inside the human flagship, in a section that did not appear on any official deck plans. Sam Harris stood at the front of the room, looking at 12 people who did not officially exist. These were the best soldiers humanity had ever produced, though their names appeared in no military records and their faces were known to no government officials. The Phantom Battalion had been created in absolute secrecy 20 years ago. Each member had been recruited from the top special forces units on Earth, then put through training that pushed the limits of human capability. They had undergone procedures that enhanced their reflexes, sharpened their minds, and strengthened their bodies beyond normal human levels. Most importantly, they had learned to think in ways that no alien military strategist could predict. Nina Clark ran her fingers along the surface of her combat suit. The material felt smooth like silk, but she knew it was stronger than any armor the galactic armies used. The suit could change its appearance to match any surface, making her invisible to both the naked eye and electronic sensors. Built into the fabric were weapons that could cut through metal, shields that could stop energy blasts, and communication systems that worked across vast distances. The technology had been developed in research facilities that officially did not exist, funded by budgets that were hidden within other budgets. Human scientists had spent decades studying alien equipment captured in battle, reverse engineering their best innovations, and then improving upon them. The result was gear that was 50 years ahead of anything the Zelkari or Thraxians possessed. Ben Foster studied the holographic display showing 17 different locations across 7 star systems. Each target had been chosen carefully after months of intelligence gathering. Human spy networks had infiltrated both empires, mapping their command structures, identifying their key facilities, and learning their security protocols. The aliens thought their secrets were safe, but human operatives had been watching and listening for years. The plan was beautiful in its simplicity. Rather than attacking armies or destroying fleets, they would strike at the heart of both empires' ability to wage war. Command centers would lose their ability to coordinate attacks. Manufacturing plants would stop producing weapons. Communication networks would go silent. Supply chains would collapse. In 5 hours, both sides would find themselves unable to continue fighting. Amy Johnson connected her tablet to the room's main computer and began uploading mission data directly to each operative's neural implant. The technology allowed information to be transferred instantly to their minds, giving them perfect knowledge of building layouts, security systems, and guard rotations. They would enter enemy facilities knowing every corridor, every camera, and every potential threat. The neural implants had been the most controversial part of the Phantom Battalion project. Critics argued that modifying human brains crossed ethical lines that should never be crossed. Supporters pointed out that the alternative was allowing the galactic war to continue indefinitely. In the end, the 12 volunteers had made the choice themselves, knowing the risks and accepting the consequences. Each operative had a specific target and a specific mission. Alex Turner would infiltrate the Zelkari Supreme Command Center on their capital world, using his suit's camouflage. to walk past security guards and his neural implant to hack their computer systems. Katie Bell would penetrate the Thraxian War College, corrupting strategic databases and planting false information that would confuse their military planning for months. Chris Brown had the most dangerous assignment, destroying the Zelkari weapons, factories on 3 different worlds. His suit contained explosives so advanced that they could be programmed to destroy specific equipment while leaving everything else untouched. The factories would be reduced to useless scrap metal, but no workers would be harmed. Diana White would target the Thraxian fuel refineries that produced the exotic matter powering their space fleets. Without fuel, their massive warships would become floating monuments to their former power. She carried devices that could contaminate fuel supplies, making them unusable without causing environmental damage to the planets where the refineries operated. The remaining 8 operatives had equally important missions: disabling communication, satellites, sabotaging supply depots, corrupting computer networks, and spreading disinformation through enemy intelligence services. Each action was small by itself, but together they would bring down both empires' war machines. Sam Harris looked at his watch. In 6 hours, they would launch from the flagship in small, stealthy craft that registered as space debris on enemy sensors. The ships themselves were technological marvels, powered by engines that produced no heat signature and covered in materials that absorbed radar waves instead of reflecting them. The operatives began their final equipment checks. Nina tested her suit's camouflage functions, watching as the material changed colors to match the briefing room's walls. Ben verified that his neural implant was receiving clear signals from the mission computers. Amy confirmed that her hacking tools were loaded with the latest alien security codes stolen by human intelligence. They had trained for this mission for 2 years, practicing in simulations that recreated every detail of their target locations. They had studied alien psychology, learned to think like their enemies, and prepared for every possible complication. But now, faced with the reality of what they were about to attempt, even these elite soldiers felt the weight of responsibility. The fate of the galaxy rested in their hands. Billions of lives depended on their success. 600 years of war would end or continue based on what 12 humans could accomplish in the next 5 hours. It was a burden that would have crushed ordinary people. But the members of Phantom Battalion were far from ordinary. As they prepared to leave the briefing room, each operative knew they might not return. Their mission was dangerous beyond measure, striking at the heart of 2 vast empires that would kill them without hesitation if discovered. But they also knew that failure was not an option. Too much was at stake, and too many people were counting on them. The Ghost Protocol was about to begin. The first hour began in complete silence. Alex Turner floated in space just outside the Zelkari Supreme Command Center, his suit making him invisible against the stars. The massive space station rotated slowly below him, its lights creating patterns that looked almost beautiful from this distance. But Alex knew that inside those walls, military leaders were planning attacks that would kill millions more innocent people. His suit's computer showed him the station's docking bay schedule. Supply transport was approaching from the port side, following the same route it had taken every week for the past 6 months. Human intelligence had been watching this station for so long that they knew when the janitors took their breaks. Alex activated his suit's thrusters and moved toward the transport ship. The transport pilot never saw him coming. Alex's suit matched the color and texture of the ship's hull perfectly as he attached himself to the cargo section. When the ship docked with the station, he simply walked off with the other workers. His suit now looked like a standard Zelkari maintenance uniform, complete with the correct identification badges and work orders. Security guards glanced at him, but saw nothing unusual. Their scanners detected no weapons, no explosives, no threat of any kind. They had no way of knowing that Alex's suit contained technology that could penetrate their strongest defenses. He walked through 3 checkpoints, took 2 elevators, and entered the command center's main computer room without anyone questioning his presence. The central computer core was the brain of the Zelkari war machine. Every battle plan, every troop movement, every supply order flowed through this system. Alex connected a small device to one of the access ports and watched as human-designed viruses began spreading through the network. The viruses were subtle, designed to cause confusion, rather than obvious damage. Commands would be delayed, coordinates would be slightly wrong, and communication links would fail at critical moments. Meanwhile, on the other side of the galaxy, Katie Bell was walking through the halls of the Thraxian Imperial War College. Her suit had taken on the appearance of a Thraxian military uniform, and her neural implant was feeding her the correct responses to give when other officers spoke to her. She had studied Thraxian military customs for months, learning their salutes, their ranks, and their formal speech patterns. The War College was where the Federation's best military minds planned their strategies. Hundreds of officers worked day and night, analyzing battle reports and designing new tactics to defeat the Zelkari. Their computers contained detailed maps of enemy positions, lists of available resources, and projected outcomes for different attack scenarios. Katie's job was to turn all of that valuable information into useless garbage. She entered the Strategic Planning Center during the shift change, when dozens of officers were moving in and out of the room. In the confusion of people coming and going, nobody noticed one more uniform among the crowd. Katie approached a computer terminal and inserted a data chip that looked identical to the ones the Thraxians used every day. The chip contained a virus that would slowly corrupt every file it touched. Battle plans would develop errors that made them impossible to execute. Supply calculations would show resources that did not exist. Intelligence reports would contain false information that would send Thraxian forces to the wrong locations. The virus would spread through the entire network, but so gradually that it would take weeks for anyone to realize what had happened. The second hour brought destruction to the war industries of both empires. Chris Brown materialized inside the Zelkari weapons manufacturing complex on Kepler 442b, his suit having carried him past sensors that should have detected any intruder. The factory was enormous, with production lines that stretched for kilometers and machinery that worked around the clock to produce instruments of death. Chris moved through the facility like a ghost, placing small explosive charges at key points throughout the production system. The charges were marvels of human engineering, capable of destroying specific equipment while leaving everything else completely undamaged. Computer-controlled cutting lasers would be ruined, but the walls around them would not even be scratched. Assembly robots would be reduced to scrap metal, but workers in the next room would never know anything had happened. When the charges detonated, they did so with perfect timing and precision. Production lines that had operated for decades suddenly went silent. Machinery that had seemed indestructible fell apart in showers of sparks. The factory's ability to produce weapons vanished in seconds, but not a single worker was injured. The explosions were so precisely controlled that some employees did not even realize anything had happened until they tried to start their equipment. At the same time, Diana White was completing her mission at the Thraxian fuel refineries. The exotic matter that powered their space fleets was produced at only 3 locations in the entire Federation, making them perfect targets for sabotage. Diana had visited all 3 refineries in the past hour, moving between them in a ship that was too small and too stealthy for enemy sensors to detect. Her method was different from Chris's explosives, but equally effective. She introduced chemical compounds into the refining process that would make the fuel unstable and unusable. The compounds were designed to work slowly so that fuel already in storage would remain safe, but new production would be contaminated. Within hours, the Thraxian fleet would begin running out of power, stranding their ships wherever they happened to be. The third hour saw the collapse of communication networks across both empires. Phantom operatives had infiltrated relay stations, satellite control centers, and communication hubs throughout Zelkari and Thraxian space. They did not destroy the equipment, which would have been easily replaced. Instead, they corrupted the software that controlled the networks, inserting subtle errors that would cause messages to be sent to the wrong recipients or delayed for hours or days. Military commanders trying to coordinate attacks found that their orders never reached their subordinates. Fleet captains discovered that they could not contact their home bases. Intelligence agencies lost touch with their field agents. The vast communication networks that both empires depended on for military coordination began breaking down in ways that seemed random but were actually carefully planned. As the third hour ended, chaos was beginning to spread through both military hierarchies. Orders were not being followed because they were not being received. Reinforcements were not arriving because they had not been requested. Supply convoys were sitting idle because no one knew where to send them. The war machines of both empires were grinding to a halt, not because they lacked weapons or soldiers, but because they had lost the ability to use them effectively. The Phantom Battalion had struck 12 targets in the first 3 hours, and every mission had succeeded perfectly. But the hardest part was still to come. The fourth hour began with panic spreading across both empires like wildfire. Kevin Scott watched the operation from the human command ship, monitoring dozens of screens that showed the collapse of military systems throughout Zelkari and Thraxian space. Reports were flooding in from intelligence sources embedded deep within both governments, and every message told the same story. Chaos was taking hold. On the Zelkari homeworld, military commanders were discovering that their orders were not reaching their fleets. Admiral Korvash had been trying for 2 hours to contact his battle group near the Centauri system, but every message either failed to send or came back garbled beyond recognition. His communication officers reported that their equipment was working perfectly, but somehow no one could explain why their signals were not getting through. The weapons factories that had supplied the Zelkari military for centuries had gone silent without warning. Production supervisors stood in empty factories, staring at machinery that had simply stopped working. Engineers examined the broken equipment and found damage so precise that it seemed impossible. Critical components had been destroyed while parts just millimeters away remained untouched. It was as if someone had performed surgery on their entire industrial complex. At the same time, Thraxian fuel depots across the Federation were reporting massive contamination problems. Ships that had refueled in the past few hours were finding that their engines would not start. Fleet Captain Zorex watched in horror as his flagship's power systems began shutting down one by one. His chief engineer reported that their fuel had somehow become chemically unstable, making it impossible to use safely. But the real terror was just beginning. Rachel Stone had reached her target in the depths of the Zelkari Imperial Palace. The Emperor's private bunker was supposed to be the most secure location in the Empire, protected by layers of shields, sensors, and guards. Yet Rachel walked through the defenses as if they did not exist, her suit's advanced technology making her invisible to every security system. Emperor Vorthak was alone in his private chambers, reviewing casualty reports from the latest battles. He was a proud ruler who had never shown fear in 6 centuries of war, but tonight something felt different. The reports he was reading made no sense. His forces were not being defeated in battle. They were simply disappearing from contact. Entire fleets had gone silent, and no one could explain why. Rachel appeared in the room like a shadow becoming solid. Her suit shifted from its camouflage mode to reveal a human form that seemed to materialize from empty air. The Emperor's security alarms should have detected her presence immediately, but they remained silent. His guards should have rushed to protect him, but they never received the alert signals. She spoke in perfect Zelkari, her neural implant providing flawless translation. Her message was simple and devastating: surrender now, or face complete destruction. She explained that his military had been systematically dismantled by forces he could not see or fight. His weapons factories were destroyed, his communication networks were corrupted, and his fleets were powerless. The war was over, whether he accepted it or not. Before the Emperor could respond, Rachel vanished as suddenly as she had appeared. Her suit returned to camouflage mode, making her invisible again as she walked past his guards and left the palace. Vorthak was left alone, staring at empty air, and wondering if he had just experienced a nightmare, or if his empire was truly as helpless as the mysterious visitor had claimed. Tony Lewis was delivering the same message to Supreme Admiral Craxon on the Thraxian capital ship. The admiral was a veteran of hundreds of battles, a warrior who had never retreated from any fight. But when a human soldier appeared in his private quarters, speaking perfect Thraxian and demonstrating impossible technology, even his courage wavered. The psychological impact was exactly what human strategists had planned. Both leaders now understood that their enemies could reach them anywhere, at any time, despite their best defenses. If humans could walk into the most secure locations in both empires without being detected, what else might they be capable of? The fear of the unknown was more powerful than any weapon. Industrial sabotage had triggered cascading failures throughout both military systems. Without fuel, Thraxian ships were stranded in space, their crews helpless as their life support systems slowly drained backup power. Without weapons, Zelkari, ground forces found themselves facing enemies they could not fight effectively. Without communications, both empires' command structures fell apart as officers lost contact with their superiors and subordinates. The domino effect was spreading beyond purely military targets. Trade routes that had supplied both empires were disrupted when merchant ships could not get clearance to dock at military stations. Civilian communication networks began experiencing problems as they shared infrastructure with military systems. Fuel shortages affected not just warships, but also the transport vessels that carried food and medical supplies to border worlds. Most importantly, something unprecedented was happening on the front lines. Without orders from their commanders and lacking the equipment to continue fighting, soldiers from both sides were beginning to interact with each other in ways that had not happened in 6 centuries. On a dozen different worlds, Zelkari and Thraxian troops found themselves in the strange situation of being enemies who could no longer fight. Lieutenant Zorak of the Zelkari Marines had been pinned down in a ruined city for 3 days, waiting for reinforcements that never came. His communication equipment had stopped working that morning, and his weapons were running low on power. When he saw Thraxian soldiers in a similar situation across the street, something unexpected happened. Instead of shooting at each other, they simply stared. Sergeant Thais of the Thraxian infantry was equally confused. Her orders had been to hold this position until relieved, but no relief was coming. Her fuel reserves were nearly empty, and her supply convoy had not arrived as scheduled. When she noticed that the Zelkari troops seemed to be having the same problems, she made a decision that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. She stood up slowly, her hands visible and empty of weapons. The Zelkari soldiers tensed, expecting an attack, but she simply walked toward them. When she got close enough to speak, she asked a question that neither side had heard in living memory. Did they have any extra water to share? Her troops were running low, and the nearest supply depot was not responding to communication attempts. Similar scenes were playing out across dozens of battlefields as the infrastructure of war collapsed around the soldiers who had been fighting it. Without fuel, food, ammunition, or orders, the practical business of staying alive became more important than the ancient hatred between empires. Some shared medical supplies with wounded enemies. Others pooled their remaining rations to feed everyone in the area. As the 4th hour ended, both empires were discovering that they had lost the ability to wage war. Their leaders sat in secure bunkers, terrified by visits from invisible enemies. Their factories stood silent and broken. Their fleets drifted powerless in space. Their communication networks carried only static and confusion. The longest war in galactic history was ending not with a final battle, but with a whimper of mechanical failure and human exhaustion. All that remained was for someone to officially acknowledge what had already become reality. The 5th hour arrived with a silence that had not existed in the galaxy for 600 years. Patricia Wells stood on the bridge of the human flagship, watching her screens as reports came in from across known space. Every indicator showed the same impossible result. The war was over. Not because one side had won, but because neither side could continue fighting. The extraction signals began appearing on her command display. One by one, the 12 members of Phantom Battalion confirmed their mission completion. Alex Turner had successfully corrupted the Zelkari command network and was moving to his pickup point. Katie Bell reported that Thraxian strategic planning was in complete chaos, and she was ready for retrieval. Chris Brown confirmed that weapons production had stopped across 3 star systems. Sam Harris received the final confirmation message as his team began their silent withdrawal from enemy territory. The mission had been completed with perfect precision. Every target had been hit, every objective achieved, and most importantly, not a single enemy soldier had been killed in the process. The Phantom Battalion had accomplished what conventional armies could not. They had ended a war without adding to its casualty count. The operatives moved toward their extraction points using the same stealth technology that had gotten them into enemy territory. Their ships remained invisible to sensors as they departed from Zelkari and Thraxian space. Within an hour, all 12 would be back aboard the human flagship, their identities still secret and their mission officially non-existent. Elena Martinez sat in the Galactic Council chamber, watching in amazement as emergency communications flooded the system. Both the Zelkari Emperor and the Thraxian Supreme Admiral were requesting immediate meetings with Council mediators. These were the same leaders who had refused to even acknowledge each other's right to exist for decades. Now they were practically begging for peace talks. The Emperor's message was brief but desperate. His military forces had suffered what he called a complete systems failure. His fleets were powerless, his factories were silent, and his communication networks had collapsed. He requested immediate assistance from neutral parties to arrange a ceasefire while his engineers tried to understand what had happened to their equipment. Admiral Craxon's message was equally urgent. The Thraxian military had experienced simultaneous breakdowns across all major systems. Their fuel supplies were contaminated, their strategic computers were corrupted, and their command structure had lost contact with field units. He was willing to discuss peace terms if the Zelkari would agree to stop their attacks. Neither leader understood that their enemies were experiencing identical problems. Both thought they were the victims of some new Zelkari or Thraxian superweapon. Neither imagined that a third party had systematically disabled both of their war machines in a single coordinated operation. Lisa Parker presented her analysis to the stunned council members. The war had ended not through military victory but through the elimination of military capability. Both empires still possessed millions of soldiers, thousands of ships, and vast industrial resources. But without fuel, communications, weapons production, and command coordination, none of those assets could be used for warfare. The beauty of the human strategy became clear as Lisa explained the situation. Traditional military thinking focused on destroying enemy forces, which led to endless cycles of retaliation and escalation. But the Phantom Battalion had targeted the infrastructure that made war possible, leaving both sides with armies that could not fight, even if they wanted to, continue the conflict. Jake Sullivan monitored communications from the front lines where the most remarkable changes were taking place. On world after world, Zelkari and Thraxian forces were discovering that their ancient enemies were facing the same equipment failures and supply shortages. Practical necessity was forcing cooperation between soldiers who had been trained to hate each other. On Kepler 186F, a joint Zelkari-Thraxian medical station had been established to treat wounded soldiers from both sides. The doctors had run out of medical supplies days ago when their supply convoys stopped coming, but they found that pooling their remaining resources allowed them to help everyone who needed treatment. In the Vega system, stranded ship crews from both empires were working together to repair damaged vessels. Zelkari engineers had expertise with shield generators, while Thraxian technicians understood engine systems better. By sharing knowledge and equipment, they were able to get their ships running well enough to return home. Most significantly, on the contested world of New Geneva, military commanders from both sides had called an informal truce while they tried to figure out what had happened to their equipment. Colonel Vex of the Zelkari and Major Thane of the Thraxians found themselves sitting across from each other at a negotiating table, discussing practical matters like food distribution and prisoner exchanges. The conversation had started as a temporary arrangement to deal with immediate problems, but both officers quickly realized they had more in common than they had expected. Both were tired of fighting. Both wanted to go home to their families. Both were intelligent enough to see that continuing the war would accomplish nothing except more death and suffering. Ryan Adams deleted the classified files from his personal computer, removing all traces of Operation Clean Sweep from the official record. The mission had never happened. The Phantom Battalion did not exist, and the sudden end of the Galactic War was simply an unexplained coincidence. Future historians would debate for centuries how two vast empires had simultaneously lost the ability to wage war, but they would never know the truth. Elena began preparing for the most important negotiations in galactic history. Representatives from both empires were already requesting meeting schedules, and neutral worlds were offering to host peace conferences. After 6 centuries of failed diplomacy, suddenly everyone wanted to talk instead of fight. The 12 members of Phantom Battalion returned to their secret base on Earth, where they would resume their official non-existence. Their names would never appear in history books, their faces would never be shown in documentaries, and their families would never know what they had accomplished. They had saved billions of lives and ended 6 centuries of suffering, yet their greatest achievement would remain forever classified. As the galaxy entered its first day of peace in living memory, trade routes began reopening, refugee camps started planning for resettlement, and children born into war finally had the chance to grow up in a world without violence. The age of endless conflict was over, and the age of rebuilding could finally begin. The longest war in galactic history had ended in complete silence, brought to a close by 12 humans who had proven that sometimes the most powerful weapon was not a gun or a bomb, but the wisdom to know exactly where to strike and when to stop. Peace had returned to the galaxy not through conquest, but through the simple act of making war impossible to continue. The future would belong to diplomats and engineers, not soldiers and generals, and somewhere in the classified archives of Earth's military intelligence, a single file remained sealed, containing the true story of how humanity had saved the galaxy in just 5 hours.